If you're using the new Z-Wave JS implementation in Home Assistant and are struggling with issues with your smart locks, well, I've got some good news for you. Stay tuned to today's video, and I'll take you through fixing some Z-Wave issues with your locks, setting up sensors to retrieve the last used code, and using this information to disable your smart alarm. I hope you'll stick around. Hey everyone, it's Ryan again. And today we're back to working with Z-Wave JS. If you watch any of my previous videos on Z-Wave JS, you may have noticed that there are some limitations that were present in the system back when it first debuted earlier in the year. Now with the last few updates, most all of the missing features have been brought into the system, including being able to adjust your Z-Wave configuration right from inside of your Home Assistant instance. The only thing that really wasn't working for me was the fact that I was not able to retrieve any information about my smart locks except for the fact whether they're locked or unlocked. Now in the original Z-Wave implementation for Home Assistant, when you added a Z-Wave lock to your system, you got two sensors that would detect the alarm state of the lock, which would indicate something like if it's been manually locked, it's been locked via the keypad, or a user code has been entered to unlock the lock, or give you some extended information like if the lock was jammed. From here, I would use that information to tell Home Assistant to disable my house's alarm system, say if one of my in-laws came over. I could also get notifications if somebody came into the house that wasn't my wife or myself. But with the Z-Wave JS implementation, I have never been able to get that to work up until today. But with Z-Wave JS, I could never get this to work no matter how many times I repaired my Schlage locks to my system. Also, on my older style lever lock, these sensors would appear, but they would never seem to update. So after actually reading the documentation and reading through a few helpful blog and forum posts, I'm now able to get on my newer Schlage touchscreen lock, I'm able to retrieve which code was entered and the current status of the lock. And on my older FE599 lever style lock, I can at least retrieve when a valid code is entered into the lock. Now I'm able to use this information to disable my smart alarm system and also notify me if a guest comes over to my house. Now in today's video, I'm going to take you through a few different steps. The first one being some troubleshooting steps if you're having troubles with your lock either not communicating properly or not being able to control things like lock and unlock. The second thing we're going to do is create a template sensor, and I'll show you actually how the newer Schlage style locks communicate with Home Assistant. Instead of utilizing a sensor, they use the event bus. So I'll show you how to set up a sensor that can pick up that information and display to you the last used code on your smart lock. In addition, if you happen to have an older style Z-Wave lock like my FE599 lever locks, I'll show you how to detect when a valid code is entered into the lock itself. And then finally, I'll show you how I use this in an automation to disable my smart alarm, which is integrated in Home Assistant, and then push out information about who entered the code in the door. All right, so with all that ahead of us, let's go ahead and get started. So there are a couple things that you can try if you're having issues with your locks not properly showing the lock or unlock data, or you're not able to actually lock or unlock them from Home Assistant. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell Home Assistant to re-interview the locks. This will basically re-exchange all of the data that's sent during pairing mode and should take care of some of the issues if you're having them. So again, these instructions are specifically for Schlage locks. That's all I have. But they're pretty easy to adapt for other locks. Just check your manual. I'm sure they'll have that details of how to get it in and out of pairing mode and things like that. First thing you're going to need to do is locate your programming code. Now this is typically on the inside of the lock, so the portion of the lock that's on the inside of the house, and it usually faces the door itself, so you'll have to take that inside part off, and you'll need to find the code inside of there. On mine, they're on the yellow stickers on the inside, but again, that could vary from lock to lock. Or you can use the card that came with the lock with your initial user codes and programming codes. Next, we will take the programming code and enter it into the lock. This is typically a 6-digit code. And then once you do that, the lock will wake up and it's ready for another command like adding in door codes or setting it into exclusion or exclusion mode. So next we'll go into Home Assistant. We'll click on Configuration, go to Integrations, Z-Wave JS, and then click Configure. Now scroll down and find your particular lock, and then select it, and then click Re-Interview. Now you might have to wake the lock back up again by entering the program code, or on Schlage locks, you may need to put it into programming mode by entering the code, pressing the Schlage button, and then hitting 0 to put it into exclude or exclude mode. Don't worry, it won't remove the lock unless you have your hub giving the exclusion command. Now if this doesn't work, we can move on to phase 2, which is to unpair and repair the lock. Now, very similarly, you need to go to the Z-Wave integration configuration portion, and then there's a remove node button on this page. Click the remove node button and then enter your programming code, hit the Schlage button, and then 0 to put the lock into exclusion mode. you should notice the light will flash green until it stops beeping, and then you'll see that Home Assistant will exit the page, indicating that it's removed the node. You can verify this by seeing the node count will have dropped by 1 digit. Then you do the exact same thing, but this time put Home Assistant into add node mode, and then make sure you check the box for using secure inclusion. This is required for locks. So once you do that, putting the hub into pairing mode, then go back to your lock again, re-enter the pairing code, Schlag button, and 0, and the lock should pair itself. Again, once it finishes beeping, then you'll notice that Home Assistant will exit that page, and then you can check back in a few minutes and verify that your lock has now been re-added into Home Assistant. Now finally, if this doesn't seem to fix the problem, you need to bring your physical Home Assistant hardware with your Z-Wave stick closer to the lock itself, or take the lock closer to the Z-Wave hub. Now I haven't had this problem much with mine, but in older hubs I've had this issue where I've had to bring the devices closer together to make sure that secure channel gets established between the two of them. All right, now that we have a working lock, let's move on to how the new Z-Wave JS integration actually communicates lock changes to Home Assistant. So in Z-Wave JS, the extended lock information isn't transmitted via a sensor. It's actually sent on the Home Assistant event bus. So if you jump over to Developer Tools and then go to the Events tab, you'll see all the different events that can be listened to in Home Assistant. Now at the very bottom, you'll see Z-Wave JS notification. Now I like to copy this, and then you can paste it into the Listen to Events section and then hit Start Listening. And then this will give you the output of all of the information your lock is sending every time you lock and unlock the door. With this screen pulled up, go ahead and go to your lock and enter one of your user codes. And then when you come back to your screen, you'll notice output on the screen. Once you get this event, I usually grab the entire thing and paste it into Notepad. From this, you'll want to extract 3 key pieces of data. First will be the device's ID. It's a long hexadecimal string that we'll use to filter out just this particular lock's information. The next is the field that sends the lock state. So we'll grab the path for this one. This tells us what the last event on the lock was, whether it was locked or unlocked manually, unlocked via code, or happens to be jammed or some other information. And finally, you'll see the user code that was entered if the particular event was entering a user code. Now from here, you can extract the location of each of these in the JSON objects. You'll need to know each of the keys for the JSON objects, so that way you can filter those out in the automation. So I usually like to keep this pulled up just for reference. So now we got the 3 pieces of information we need to go forward with our automation. Now before we get on to the automations, I want to take a second to thank a few people for their support. Thanks to Kirby Drum and Anthony Birchall for buying me a beer. Today's beer is Queen City American Lager from Springfield, Missouri, from the Great Escape Beer Works. Cheers to you both, and thanks for supporting the channel. Now, if you'd like to support the channel, you can also buy me a beer by clicking this link below, or if you want to purchase any of the items from the kits in the description, all that goes to support the channel and helps me keep everything going and proving to my wife that this is actually a feasible side gig. So just as a reminder, if you found value in this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. So now that we've tested the event bus and we have the parameters we need, let's jump into creating automations with these. All right, so before we can create these automations, we need to go ahead and build the helpers that are necessary to display the information from our event bus. So to create the helpers, we go to Configuration, scroll down to Helpers, and we're going to need to create 3 separate helpers. The first will be an input text, and this will be front lock status. You can give it a custom icon. We'll just hit create. The next, we'll need to create a number, and this will be front lock user code. This will be used to hold the code that is input in whenever a user unlocks a door. And finally, this optionally, if you'd like to display the user that's actually opening the door by correlating the user's number with their name, we could use front lock last user. And again, this is just a standard text. We'll hit create. Now make sure when you create the user code that you select input field and not slider. That way it shows up correctly in the UI. And if you have more than one lock that you're wanting to do this with, go ahead and create those 3 helpers for the additional locks that you have in your system. So let's move on to the automations to populate these helpers. All right, so before we get into the automations, I just want to note that all of the code, all the example code here is in a blog post linked right here below. So if you just want to copy and paste this code from here, feel free to do that. If not, I'm going to go through and explain each of the phases going forward. So go back to configuration, automations, add automation, and we'll create an empty one. Give this a name like front lock status. So I'll take the information I pulled off of the event bus, and I have blurred out part of or removed part of my device ID just for security reasons. All right, now that we've got the name for a trigger, we're going to go to event, and that event type is going to be the Z-Wave JS notification, just like it was on the other tab, Z-Wave JS notification. And we're not going to collect any event data because we're going to be checking it with a condition. And then conditions. So if you don't have if you only have a single lock, you can ignore the condition here. This is just because I have two separate locks. I want to make sure I send the information from the correct lock to the correct set of helpers. All right, so from here, we're going to make a condition of type template. And then in the value template here, we put in the two curly braces, trigger.event.data. So what this is going to do is this is the built-in home automation variable that brings in the information from the event bus. So it's going to take whatever data that triggered this particular automation, it's going to go into the data field, and then we need to see where we need to traverse down to grab the next key. So in this case, it's data, which we already have here, and then we need to put another period and then find device ID. So we'll copy that. So in this case, it'll be trigger.event.data.device ID. Remember, this could be different depending on which lock that you happen to have. Now, we want to see if it equals, and then we'll want to put our device ID in here, and then go ahead and close out our curly braces. So what this is going to do is this is going to see if the data.device ID from the event trigger equals our ID. And if it does, it'll continue the actions. If not, it'll stop. And then under actions, we'll want to go to call service. In this case, we're going to call input_text set. So we want to call input text set, pick our entity, and in this case, this would be the front lock status. And then under value, it's not going to let you put the template in here because of the way the visual editor works. And then for value, if you paste in one of the templates, it's going to automatically switch over from the visual editor to the YAML editor. So in this case, we are going to set it to trigger.event.data.event label. So if we look again at our output data, we see we have one called event label that gives us what happened with the lock. So in this case, it was a keypad unlock operation. This would also say something like manual lock, manual unlock from the inside, that sort of thing. We want to display this in Home Assistant. So again, we do trigger.event.data.event_label and put that inside of single quotes and curly braces. And that will be our automation there. So we'll hit save. And then to test this, the easiest way would be to obviously go into your lock, manually lock or unlock it, or go outside and put a code in. And then you should notice in Home Assistant that that particular helper will update. So I'll show you on my live environment here. So if we look over here in my live environment, you'll see that this helper has changed state from manual, keypad unlock, manual lock operation, back and forth. So every time the lock updates, it'll update this variable. And of course, you could put this anywhere in Home Assistant. Now, this is an input text, so you can go in here and manually edit the text fields. And if you wanted to get rid of this, obviously you could do something like a template sensor that references this one. But for the sake of this video, you can just create an easy to use status helper. All right, so now that we have the lock status helper, let's switch over and create the automation to pull the code from the lock as it was entered. So again, we'll pop back over here to add a new automation. Call this one front lock user code. Again, the trigger is going to be off the event bus, Z-Wave JS notification. So for conditions, we want to do a template just like before. We want to have the same filter in place as we did with the other one, because again, we only want this lock's information going to this variable. But then I'll add another condition, another template condition, and this is going to be, we want to only show if the event data event is a 6. So if you go through and you watch your logs come through, you'll notice that each different one of these keypad events have a different event number. In my case, event 6 is keypad unlock operation. So what would happen if you didn't have this condition is that every time you do a manual lock or unlock, or you lock the lock, this parameter doesn't exist. And so it would just blank out your variable every time. So you'd only see this variable only right after you've unlocked the lock. Then if you lock the lock, that would clear that out. So I like to set a condition to only do that on event type 6. Again, your lock may have a different event type. Just read through the log files, the event logs, and then find the event number that matches yours. Or you could always match it to the event label if you wanted to. So again, trigger.event.data.event equals 6. Okay, so only if it matches this ID and has an event type of 6 will it continue. Now we want to go in and create a new action, and that's going to be a input number. So we're going to do a call service, and that service is input number set, pick our entity, again that front lock user code that we're going to update. Now if you notice here, this only lets you set a number in this particular field. So we're going to have to click on the 3 dots, go to edit and YAML, and then we're going to need to change this YAML here because this currently will not allow us to put in any type of template. We need to change the formats to look something like this. So I've replaced the original variable with data template, and then we've got the entity ID, input number, last front door code. And then for value, we're going to take that same trigger.event.data.parameters.userid. So if you remember, as you're going down through JSON, each time you drop into a tier, you need to include the parameter above it. So in this case, it's data, then parameters, then user ID. So that's why we have that extra dot here now. Now, because this is looking for an integer number, if you were to leave this last part off of this code here, it wouldn't work because it'll treat it as a string. So we need to put a pipe and then force it to treat it as an integer. So now once we do that, whenever the user uses a code to unlock your door, this number will be updated with the number of the user that entered it. So in this case, code 1 is my code, code 4 is my father's code, and then now I can see which code was entered on the door whenever it gets opened. All right, so for the final bit of automation, I'm not going to explain it here in the video. I'm just going to include it again in the blog post below on how to equate the code to which user actually unlocked the door. It's a simple if statement, so I decided not to include it in the video. If you have questions, though, leave it in the comments below. But go ahead and go to the blog post, and it'll show you which action to add to allow you to populate that last helper with the name of the user that unlocked. All right, so now that we've got these automations out of the way, the last thing I'll show you really quickly is if you happen to have an alarm that's connected to your Home Assistant instance, how to use a user unlocking a door to trigger a disarm on your smart alarm. Now for this last quick section, I'll show you how to create an automation that will disable your smart alarm that's been integrated into Home Assistant. Now in my Home Assistant, I have a alarm. I just have a manual MQTT alarm, which means I can set its status via MQTT or using a Home Assistant call. So I can either set the alarm or disable the alarm or anything like that. You could also integrate your existing alarm panel using a variety of tools out there. But in my case, I just have an alarm that only exists inside of Home Assistant. And it has a code to arm and disarm, and it can be set to arm away or arm home or anything like that. So what I've done is basically created the exact same automation as before. You could even add this to the last automation if you wanted to, if you didn't want to create a brand new one. So I've given it a name, called it front lock disarm alarm, same trigger, event, ZWave.js notification, same 2 template conditions. I want to only do this for the particular lock that I care about right now. And I also only want this to happen on a successful unlock of the lock, which in my case is event 6. Then for the actions, call service, alarm control panel, disarm, I selected the entity out of the pick entity window. And then in my case, I went ahead and entered the code. This is obviously not the code for the alarm, but in my case, it needs to pass the code along to tell it that it's able to disarm the particular alarm. And then finally, I also have created a notify to my Telegram account that basically just sends an event that says, hey, the alarm's been disarmed by the user code that was sent above. So again, that same trigger.event.data.parameters.userid. Now again, I know this is a really quick and easy automation. Again, this is linked in the description below, but you can use this to disarm your alarm if you happen to have a alarm that's been integrated into Home Assistant. All right, so there we go. Now we should have our Z-Wave locks where they can properly communicate with Home Assistant, and you can now control the lock and unlock states, which shows you that it is communicating securely with Home Assistant. You've got a couple of sensors that now show you the status of your lock and also who is the last person to enter the code on your door. And finally, you can now take that information and use it to action something in Home Assistant like disabling an alarm or notifying you if a guest has entered your house. So I hope you found this video helpful. As always, if you have any suggestions for future videos, please leave them in the description below. I am working on a second video, a follow-along video to my Roborock. I've had a couple people ask questions about how to do certain things with the Roborock integration, and so I'll be doing that hopefully in the next few weeks. In addition, I'm playing around with doing some very short form shorts on YouTube for some quick tips. So if you like those, please let me know in the comments. As always, please make sure to give the video a thumbs up if this video was helpful for you. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and ring the notification bell to be notified of new videos coming out in the next few weeks. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this week, and I hope you have a great rest of your summer.